imprisoned. I was shot with my hands in the air. I was accused of a wide variety of crimes, all of which, with the exception of the murder of a New Jersey state trooper, I was acquitted. I was tried for the murder of a New Jersey state trooper by an all-white jury in a highly prejudiced county where something like 70% of those polled already believed I was guilty. I was tried in the press for years. I was subsequently convicted. I was sentenced to life, plus 30 years in prison, plus 30 years because I would not stand up for the judge. I spent 6.5 years in prison. 2 of those 6.5 years I spent in solitary confinement in men's prisons, which was against New Jersey law, but nevertheless, that's where I was sent, and that's where I spent 2 years. And I subsequently escaped. I came to Cuba in 1984. I've been here ever since. I have written one book, which is an autobiography. I am now working on another book, which is about the ideological development of the Black liberation movement in the United States. And so I would like to just open up the floor for people's questions, whether they're about Cuba, whether they're about me, whether they're about whatever.
Access to police files or anything of that sort.
Okay. There are so many political prisoners, approximately 100, and resources are very thin. And, you know, I mean, there are not that many resources, so that most of the effort of people who supported me is now directed toward supporting other political prisoners. And like there have been, for example, if I had not escaped, I would next year be in prison. It would be 20 years. Sundia Ada Akoli, who was arrested with me, who's on the case with me, has been in prison almost 20 years. It's been 19 years. There are other political prisoners who have been in prison for 20 years, others 21, and others 22 years. For example, Geronimo Pratt will soon be in prison 22 years, and even though there's an enormous amount of evidence pointing to the fact that A, he was framed, B, the government knows he was framed, is completely innocent. I mean, there have been special given by, what is that program, 60 Minutes, he's been on 60 Minutes. Agents, FBI agents have come forward and said that they know that he is innocent, that he was in fact framed by the government. The FBI has made statements saying that he was supposed to have been, and now that there are many people who are testifying that he was at a meeting of the Black Panther Party during the time when the crime was supposedly committed miles and miles away, more than 500 miles away. And the FBI says that even though he was under day-to-day surveillance, they started keeping records the day after the event, and those other records disappeared. So we're dealing with blatant violations of not only people's human rights, but of their civil rights, you know, and people are very unaware in the United States of the fact that A, that they are political prisoners, and B, that these political prisoners have been in prison basically since the early 70s, some of them since the late 60s. And I mean, it's criminal that they are there, and part of the reason that I believe that they are still there and that there's so little work being done around political prisoners is A, because the government still maintains a kind of COINTEL program, which part of that COINTEL program under another name is dedicated to minimizing and criminalizing the Black liberation movement, African people, and so that there, within the left, is a kind of idea that these people must have been done something, or they're infantile leftists who are not worthy of being supported, and that these people are really not political priorities. But my question is, if we accept the government's definition of who people who struggle are, then we are in fact negating the legitimacy of the Puerto Rican liberation struggle, of the Black liberation movement, and of those anti-imperialists who have shown solidarity with oppressed people in the United States, of those people who, and I mean, the people are in prison for being part of the anti-nuclear movement, for being activists in all segments of the movement. So it's not just one segment of the movement that is represented in terms of political prisoners. In my case, getting back to your question, I think that given the current administration, given the right-wing nature of the U.S. government, which seems to be moving closer and closer to fascism, there is very little hope that any court will give me justice. And I think that the same applies to other people who have been victimized by the government. I think that the only way that most political prisoners will be freed is that there is a massive popular movement which demands amnesty for all of those political prisoners. And I think that in my case, I would fall under that Amnesty Act, but I think that, I mean, it would take a great deal of power.
There are a number of comrades over the years that have had the ability to not be incarcerated in these dungeons, and Cuba gave them asylum in terms of that. So that part of the film I thought was important in terms of that. And since we just lost Sister Assata, I think one of the spirits of and the honoring of her has to be combined with the question that she lived free, that she did not live captured in a dungeon, where many of her comrades actually, that's where they spent their lives in that regard. So we are always beholden to the Cuban Revolution, because it was revolution that made that a possibility. It was the unity of the Cuban people with a revolutionary politic to resistance to, even up to this day right now, Cuba is free. And it's free because of the unity of its people around a revolutionary political line. And you heard Fidel. Fidel's always teaching. You know, Fidel speaks perfect English. Speaks perfect English. But just in terms of who he is, that's how he relates and stuff like that. So, you know, I thought it was a historic piece. And actually, the conference itself, if you go to Google, the conference itself is under Fidel and Malcolm X and the Black Liberation Movement. And actually, after all these years, it's still actually up online. There's some parts of it in terms of that. Other folks who were there, Brother Lumbe Graf and Father Lawrence Lucas, if people ever knew of him, he was in the December 12th movement too. Revolutionary Catholic priest. You know, we used to always carry his 357 Magnum around with him in terms of that. But I think the spirit of this, and you heard Assata, she was really waiting for this moment. We had a chance to really travel. She was with us the entire time, the whole week. And we traveled around, we went to the Island of Youth. We traveled around Cuba itself. And she was, and you know, it was really great for her because, you know, just to be with our homies, you know, in terms of that. So that was one of the beautiful things about it. And, you know, since that time, a number of people have been to Cuba. A number of people had a chance. Some of our youth at that time had a number of opportunities to actually talk with her. Some people have been there. So she lived a quality life. And I think that's what I think people really feel about it. That her legacy was one of a freedom fighter. You know, a sister who was a freedom fighter. They lied about her and said all kind of stuff about her. But the bottom line is she lived free, you know, and I think for our people, certainly our people look at the question that here's a victory. You know, sometimes our victories are far and in between, but here is a concrete victory in that regard. So we should always make sure that we honor and respect the Cuban Revolution because of what it's meant to us, you know, and that brings concretely in terms of that. So this was our way of just saying to pay some homage to Assata in Cuba. We thought that film captured that because it gave you some history. As one says, if you don't know your history, then you don't know who you are. You'll be somebody else if you don't know your history in that regard. So that was what this film was in terms of what we wanted to talk about. Thank you, Cam, in terms of your contribution. She's getting ready to go back to Cuba again. We were in Cuba in December at a conference. And you know, we took a delegation there, and she was part of a delegation there. We kind of did things together there in terms of this conference. But I think the important thing is that to get our young folks, you know, Malcolm used to say, travel expands your mind. You know, if you learn the world through the daily news, you're in trouble. And now every station, every aspect is just being taken over, and a whole different story's being given and stuff. So yeah, so you know, so straight ahead, have a safe trip in that regard. You know, back again. But Cuba's continues to represent that kind of revolutionary spirit, and they continue to be under sanctions and a blockade to try to crush their revolution. So we should always be ready and prepared to support, you know, and give support to Cuba. And one of the best ways to do that is to fight against ignorance about it. You know, just ignorance, people's understanding, and, you know, what's happening, and be able to speak about that, you know. Malcolm used to say sometimes the enemy will have you hating your friends and loving your enemies if you're not clear who you are in that regard. So straight ahead. The other part of this, and which I'm going to have, let me just tell you who, the NY8, this is October 17, and it was in 1984 when we were arrested by the FBI and the Joint Terrorist Task Force. 500 agents swept across New York City and arrested. I just want to let folks know who we are. It's Colette Peen. Colette, there's Lakeisha Carter. There's Roger Merriman. Yes, and myself. And there's Coltrane Chimaranga. There's Robert Taylor, and there's Viola Coleman, who is the former chairperson of the City Council, and the real spirit behind our efforts. There she is on the back wall up there too. You know, she passed away last year, and we lost her and stuff, but people who knew her knew she was like the real fighting spirit. You know, you know, our sisters keep our culture. Bottom line, that's where our culture rests at, with our sisters, in terms of the many things that they do that are above and beyond all of the things that they are struggling with, the many things that they do in terms of that. So you always say, you get a revolutionary sister and you got a real revolutionary. You know what I mean? Because she's doing a lot of things at the same time in terms of that, you know. And one of the things is criticizing some of us brothers. But righteously so. Righteously so. But yeah, Jose Rios, yeah, I'm sorry, and Yvette Kelly. Those are the other two. That's why we always said the NY8 plus, because it was us, but it's everybody else in terms of that. They arrested us, the 500 agents, but also there were a number of things that they put in place. In fact, we were called the NY8 against fascist terrorism. And when you go back to that, and now they're talking about terrorism now, this has always been creeping up in the United States, and for black people, our conditions have always been under those kinds of terroristic apparatus. You know, the whole civil rights movement, the human rights movement came out of what's happening to us in that regard. But we were also the first ones in the United States held under the No Bail Act, which was called it was a preventive detention law that they had in South Africa, and they brought that here. And we were the first ones to be held under it. The second ones was the Colombo crime family, you know, the mafia. They were the second ones. In fact, when we were in jail, they wanted to ask us how are you all gonna deal with that? It's real deep. But the purpose of it is, when you get arrested, you're supposed to be presumed innocent, right? That's your right, presumed innocent. The no bail law said, if we can prove that you're a danger to the community or a risk of flight, then you have to prove that you should get bail. So we were in the longest bail hearing in the history, I think even now, the longest bail hearing in the history of the United States. They held us to try to hold us under that, but we defeated that. The other thing was we survived that night. They raided and captured us in our homes and stuff. Roger was arrested right on Flatbush Avenue, Flatbush and
between Midwood
Street, right there. They stopped him crossing the street. A bunch of JTF and stuff. You're under arrest. They went to our home. Machine guns, bazookas, all of that. Some of the neighbors said they thought it was the morning. There were so many lights. But that was to create the atmosphere of something so dangerous. That's why we've elevated this to this level in that regard. Latifah was, they used to always mistake Latifah and Viola. So they came to Latifah's house, machine guns, all of that stuff. But all the bravado was to set the tone, set that tone of what they wanted to bring down on us in terms of that. But we fought them at everything. They arrested our wives and husbands. You're not supposed to be able to testify against your spouse. Created a whole new legal theory. It's called the Chinese Wall. Since we were, a number of us, we were a conspiracy. So there were 8 of us. They created 8 grand juries. So those grand juries would hear everybody, so when you're talking, you would be talking to those grand juries, but it wouldn't be the one that involves your spouse. So they just made up stuff and created stuff. But the bottom line is, we won. And we not only won for ourselves, but we really won for our people. It was a victory for our people because people came to court every day. They packed the court every day. And we had, kudos to Gil Noble. Gil Noble did a show, He did a show. My wife went to his office and said, no, you've got to do a show. This ain't about a debate. You've got to do a show about this. And Gil said, but he did a show. And that show helped break the silence cocoon around stuff in terms of who we are in that regard. And I guess one of the last points was the grand jury. They locked people up. Some of our spouses spent more time in jail than we did because, they can hold you to testify. And the real thing is you're not being held as a criminal. They're trying to break you to find out, will you finally talk? And nobody did it in that regard. So, we defeated a number of things, but it was really a people's victory. And we came out of that trial, back into the streets again, back into, I'll hook up with Brother Sonny, one of the really great black nationalist freedom fighters, Brother Sonny.